I got a little message there. And to see faces so that it isn't just a webinar speaking into the void. I will get started right away because we don't have an infinite amount of time. And as Sven kindly mentioned, this is part of this larger book project called What is Just Translation, which I am desperately trying to finish by the end of the summer. We will see. So the basis of my talk today is a dialogue that took place at the Center for Fiction in a Brooklyn-based organization between the novelist Katie Kitamura and myself. It was a virtual event, but we had made time beforehand to meet and discuss. And in fact, most of our exchange didn't make it into the actual event. And I had a chance to mull over some of those remarks in preparing today's talk. Broadly speaking, I'll be addressing several interlocking concerns that emerged within my attempt in this most recent project on translation and justice. The latter, this project conceived as a structural system of international laws mapped onto grammatical laws and semantic grids of equivalence that broker relations among global actors in the adjudication of human rights and that mediate violence and treaty violations among sovereign nations and peoples. So that's the kind of broad context for looking at this novel. With respect to Kitamura's novel Intimacies, we can have the first slide.
Okay. 1 sec.
I found myself particularly intrigued by the depiction of the professional interpreter as, on the one hand, a fixed structure of the international court, a neutral part of the machinery, an agent of transparency and justice dispensation, and on the other hand, a subject mired in force fields of affect, prone to disorientation linguistically and socially. There we go. The book gives us a micro-scale analysis of complicity and disassociation and shows how living in the swirl of translated words and worlds unmoors the translator's ethical centeredness. Charged with the mandate to deliver consistency and transparency of meaning, bound to codes of veridiction and fidelity to the original intent of a propositional statement, and conscripted to sustain a diplomatic ideal of good faith information sharing, professional interpreters in the courtroom are themselves on trial, and of course, destined to fail the test given the limits of translatability. And yet, it is in their very failure that they become quintessential negotiators, physical embodiments of the so-called diplomatic channel. Translators quite literally channel information and influence the course of trials more than it would seem. As Michel Calon and Bruno Latour argued as early as 1981, extending Michel Serres' invocation of the god Hermes, who represents translation as a metaphor for the border crossing of disciplines like philosophy and science, that's the case they're interested in, or the fluidity of the law. Translation comprises all those, and I quote, negotiations, intrigues, calculations, acts of persuasion and violence, thanks to which an actor or force takes or causes to be conferred on itself to speak or act on behalf of another act or force, end of quote. What's crucial here, and I'll be getting into this a bit more later on, is the interpassive notion of acting on behalf of another act or force. Translation operates as a medium of delegated, distributed agency, constitutive of the matter of politics. From an actor network theory vantage, translation is an actor or a kind of quasi-object, qualified as an entity whose existence depends upon the their network of alliances within a shifting, heterogeneous, and expansive relational field. Actors, Latour and Calon underscore, can bond together in a block compromising millions of individuals. They can enter alliances with iron, with grains of sand, neurons, words, opinions, and affects, end of quote. The waywardness of translational actors in the field of public perception and in the courtroom itself, their capacity to forge allyships among persons and things where none were projected, and their crucial positioning as effaced yet consequential relay mechanisms of looks and expressions that shadow courtroom proceedings and their official legal transcripts. All this makes them ripe material for fiction, as does the fact that, that in literary history, translators, often low-paid women, were historically treated like furniture, as invisible hands of textual production and dissemination, as, if you will, literary proletarians. Legal translation, in fact, has been characterized by a translator novelist named Vincenzi Latronico as, quote, reproductive labor comparable to nursing and childcare in its low-wage pay scale and social undervaluation. Kitamura's narrative never addresses this class oppression in any obvious way, but it is arguably an implicit reckoning with the female translator's long history of systemic subordination. Intimacies tells this tale of a woman interpreter with native fluency in English, Japanese, and French, and accredited proficiency in Spanish and German. As the novel opens, we track her arrival at The Hague, a place she may or may not have visited in childhood. And we follow the narrator's initiation into the protocols of the International Court, where she will translate for suspected terrorists and war criminals. We never learn her name or many details of her background. She is an I, a first-person narrator whose accounts of her experiences as a professional interpreter alternate with and often bleed into descriptions of finding a place to live, finding a boyfriend, failing to find a social footing in an unfamiliar city. Strange, unexplained things happen in the novel. A lover who says he's separated from his wife disappears and ghosts the narrator when she sends him text messages. A bookseller is attacked. A man with a lustrous head of hair who tries to pick her up at a party turns out to be the leading defense lawyer for a war criminal whose charisma, as she translates for him, is really unnerving. Intimacies brings out the extent to which the translator is at once a figure of power, controlling the narrative, literally putting words into people's mouths, and a precarious subject, suspected of divided loyalties and decentered allegiance, treated as a feckless soul susceptible to sell out to the highest bidder. What arouses suspicion, especially in a court of law, is not only the interpreter's capacity to inhabit the headspace of rival languages, but also their pose of disinterest and impartiality. This comes up not only in Intimacies, but in many works of fiction, theater, and film. We can have the next slide, Sven, if you're there. I have in mind the movie Quo Vadis Aida, about a UN translator working in Srebrenica around the time of the 1995 Bosnian massacres. We can have the next one. As well, there we go. As well as the case of the improbably named reality winner. We can have the next slide. That's the real reality winner. She was a young female US intelligence agent with proficiency in Pashto, Dari, and Arabic, accused of leaking intercepts on Russian interference in the 2016 election. Winner received the longest sentence ever imposed in history, 5 years and 3 months for the security breach. The transcripts of Winner's FBI interrogation, adapted verbatim as the script of a play directed by Tina Satter, called Is This a Room? And we can have the next one. You can see how closely they followed her cutoffs, and these are the three agents, records the insecurity within the security state that derives from its dependency on stringers, interpreters, and translators for intelligence. I saw this play, by the way, my first post-COVID performance is amazing. So if you have a chance to see it, by all means do. Satter and Kitamura foreground how translators are always already suspect. At any moment, they can be compromised, turned from servitors of the state into spies, whistleblowers, or hackers. Consider how this plays out in a scene from a novel by the Malian writer Amadou Hampateba, in which an official interpreter for the colonial administration named Umar Sy is suspected of subverting colonial power by means of an unfaithful translation. We can have the next slide. Suleiman Bashir Dian has traced how the putative non-agency of the interpreter takes on agential powers under conditions of colonial resistance. And he was supposed to be a simple intermediary, an instrument to convey words from a language into another language, salva veritate, the information remaining unaltered. Truchement is an interesting word in French, coming from the Arabic tarjuman, meaning translator. It has then come to mean instrument or means, a channel through which some effect is produced. In this sense, the truchement is not an agent, but a tool. In this scene, agency is claimed by Umar Sy, the official interpreter. We're presented with an instance of the intermediary playing the colonial power by a false translation. So in Intimacies, this fear of sabotage inspired by the specter of false translation, together with the presumption of guilt conferred on the outlier middleman, taint the psyche of the interpreter herself. The narrator loses her moral compass, finding herself haunted by a sense of guilt by association with the war criminals for whom she translates. She's also dogged by the impression that her clients view her as a fraud, or worse, a foil for the iniquities of a colonial world system that uses its ostensibly neutral criminal justice system to whitewash exploitation, structural racism, and resource plunder. In a scene where the protagonist of Intimacies is called on to translate for a jihadi suspect, we get a foretaste of how colonial language politics, specifically the historical backdrop of French as the oppressor language in the former North African colonies, informs the stakes of the translational encounter and puts the translator on notice as an implicated representative of the neo-colonial state. We can have the next slide. I interpreted, I trailed off, the words withering in the air. The accused began speaking rapidly in Arabic, and as he continued, now looking angrily at the official and gesturing at the room around him, which was, I gathered from his tone and manner, evidently substandard or objectionable in some way, panic surged up inside me. I looked at the official who was staring at me expectantly. I shook my head. I knew hardly any Arabic and turned back to the accused. Finally, the accused stared at me and asked in French, which he spoke haltingly, but I thought fluently, why he had not been provided with an Arabic language interpreter. I began to apologize. He interrupted, holding up one hand and now refusing to look at me, as if the mere sight of me were offensive. Perhaps because I was the sole woman in the room, or perhaps it was the sound of my French that was so problematic. He began speaking again in Arabic, his voice louder, almost bellicose. I could see that the court officials were rattled and beginning to hold me responsible for the situation. It was obvious that I was failing my assigned task, if through no clear fault of my own. The man needed to be read his rights in a language that he could understand, in which I did not appear to speak. And yet, because I did not know what else to do, and because the situation seemed to require that I do something, I began to recite the text again in my offending French, speaking over him, and then asking at last if he had understood. Do you understand? I repeated. Yes, he said at last in French. So now what's laid out here, I think, and there are many things, I'm sure others could weigh in, is an extraordinary power struggle with the world languages as currency. The terrorist suspect weaponizes Arabic to contest the legitimacy of the court's case, as well as the legitimacy of the translator. On her side, the translator apologizes and goes through the motions of recognizing the suspect's right to Arabic, but the gestures ring hollow in the end, since she just goes on translating in French and forces the suspect into accepting it. This encounter raises a number of questions which we could come back to in the discussion if there's interest. Is there an inalienable right to translation, including a right to translation from minority languages, dialects, and indigenous tongues, routinely unavailable in courts of law? Is there a right to my language tantamount to a right to dignity of person? Is the right to translation a basic human right, on par with the right to a fair trial, or the right to seek asylum under conditions of political persecution? How would a universal right to language take account of differences in legal culture, native judicial tradition, or indigenous vocabularies of justice and nomos? And how is the right to a linguistic commons, with translation, as Umberto Eco once suggested, its universal tongue, compromised by the kind of neoliberal linguistic universalism ascribed, say, to Globish, conceived as an instrumental language conducive to frictionless commerce and standardized regulation? In addition to exploring the murky areas where the right to language and the right to institutional justice converge and conflict, Intimacies gives definition to the realm of what I call judicial hearing, emphasizing the play between hearing as listening, registering, and comprehending, and hearing as the occasion of having one's case adjudicated in court. This notion of hearing in a full legal dimension draws attention to that aspect of the translational process that involves a kind of ear training, scoring the unfreedoms of speech that ripple through ordinary discourse, sometimes called microaggressions. This is part of what makes author Claudia Rankine's works Citizen, an American lyric, and her more recent book, Just Us, which is obviously a play on justice, works of translation, even though they're in English. The narrator of Intimacies resembles Rankine's narrators to the extent that she is a hyper listener, someone who not only transcribes overheard lines, but also the unspoken feelings, thoughts, and emotions that hover between the lines and contour the atmosphere with undercurrents of violence. What I have put on next is a passage from Intimacies that illustrates this well. We see there's nothing essentially, and she's listening on a tram, and I won't read it all, but I'll start with 2 or 3 tram stops later. I thought I heard one of the girls say verkrachting, the Dutch word for rape. I looked up, startled. My mind had started to drift, and I was no longer following their conversation as closely as I had been when I boarded. The girl who spoke was perhaps 12 or 13 years old. Her eyes were rimmed with heavy liner, and she had a nose piercing. She continued speaking. I heard the phrase belle de politique, or thought I did, but then the girl she was speaking to began giggling in response, and after a moment, the girl with the nose piercing also began to laugh, and I was no longer certain of what I had heard. After all, rape and calling the police were not exactly a laughing matter. The girl with the nose piercing must have felt my gaze. Abruptly, she turned and stared at me. Although she was still laughing, her eyes were hard, empty, entirely mirthless. So many things struck me about this passage, starting with the way in which the allusion to invasiveness is picked up in the motif of the punk girl's nose piercing. There's a lot of piercing and breaking in here. The term verkrachting in German means broken up, ruined. We could say that the narrator, who has good German, is breaking and entering into another language, Dutch, that she knows less well than German. And actually, it all seems fun and innocent enough, testing your Dutch by listening in on a tram conversation among teenagers and seeing if you can follow. But suddenly the mood shifts, as it might when finding evidence of a serious crime in an official intercept. The possible references to rape and police solicit the translator's responsibility to bring this business to the attention of the justice system. But the uncertainty about what she's heard lands her in an epistemological morass. Nor do the affects help. Giggles erupt where they shouldn't, and a hard stare coexists with giggles, forming an unreadable tragicomic mask. This scene is premonitory, signaling an excruciating moment at the end of the novel when the narrator must reckon with this ex-president, the war criminal's acquittal. Quote, "It was another thing to see the case fail before us, to see the cracks begin to widen one by one. I saw uncertainty spread through the building, blooming like mold." Translational uncertainty and juridical uncertainty are here intertwined with a greater epistemological uncertainty that in turn points to something quite frightening, the unknowable, the unthinkable, the untranslatable that constitute the kernel of criminal motive and its mystery. It seems one way to read this untranslatability is as a figure of unknowable motives and impossible justice. In Intimacies, the sensitivity to effective nuance and tone is further charged by the fact that much of the dialogue takes place in a juridical context. Acts of mishearing, involuntary facial expressions, moments of aphasia, all become potential points on which a judgment or verdict can hinge. Intimacies, I would contend, uses translation to complicate the law and literature genre, a genre that tends to be focused on the dynamics of witnessing and confession, unreliable testimony, self-justification, and the commission of what Freud called a crime from a sense of guilt, the latter a favorite theme of writers, his favorite writer, Dostoevsky. But we find them in Shakespeare, Gide, Patricia Highsmith, all, infinite number of writers actually. These motives are present in Intimacies, but more outside the box is its crossing of courtroom drama with a translation drama. These dramas run on parallel tracks, but they interfere with each other, confounding predictable plot twists and outcomes. Consider this scene, which never resolves in any obvious way because the courtroom procedures get entangled with the narrator's personal trial translation. And we can have the next one. For the next 90 minutes, the prosecution questioned the witness over matters that were at once meandering and technical in the extreme, during which time both the prosecution and the witness seemed to grow frustrated and weary. The judges interrupted at various points, largely to urge the witness and the prosecution alike to be more succinct in their words and lines of questioning. Evidently, they were serious about being behind schedule. In the second half of the session, I began to interpret. I was more than usually nervous, not only because this was a trial of consequence and an error of interpretation could have considerable effect, but because I was afraid that Keyes, he's the defense attorney, might somehow recognize my voice, unlikely as that might be. We had, I reminded myself, met only once and barely spoken at all. Still, when I leaned forward and spoke into the microphone, my voice gave an audible wobble, so that several members of the court looked up in surprise. I felt Amina, that's her colleague, tense beside me. I found my composure soon enough to everyone's relief, or at least Amina's, who reached out and gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. Keyes did not respond to the sound of my voice, not even the tremor at the start. Nevertheless, I was relieved when the session came to an end and the presiding judge rose to her feet. Now, the narrator's relief at the conclusion of the session is compounded by what seems to be a victory over the arrogant, irrepressibly charismatic ex-president who stands accused of ethnic cleansing and mass death. And as he shuffles out of the courtroom, quote, depleted, head bowed, the narrator is congratulated by Amina, as if to say that in not succumbing to the charisma of the ex-leader and his attorney, the oily Keyes, she has not only dignified the justice system, but also surmounted her own vulnerability to sexual predators. But lest the reader come away satisfied thinking the translators reached a stable place where justice and self-protection are mutually ensured through professional translation, a curlicue of doubt starts to unravel the structures that maintain the fiction of the law as an objective, autonomous apparatus of justice-making, as well as the fiction of objective interpreters who act as mere ciphers in the transmission of testimonial evidence. The translator realizes she's implicated in the trial far beyond what she could have imagined, betrayed by affects and invulnerabilities that undo her stance of neutrality. Once the narrator admits to Amina that she had previously met the ex-president's lawyer, a meeting at which Keyes, with horrifying insouciance, had grabbed her around the waist, quote, his thumb now rubbing at the waistband of my stockings through the fabric of my skirt, the slow and regular movement both led, oops, that's a typo. I'm not sure what that, something in gratuitous. She must confront the possibility that she's potentially compromised the trial. Keyes, though himself the perpetrator of an inappropriate sexual advance, recounted like a rape, will eventually potentially use their prior meeting in his case for appeal. I said to Amina that I had once met the new defense counsel. She turned to look at me puzzled. Where? Here? As we joined the line at the cafeteria, I said, no, at a party by chance. Ah, she said. So it's not as if you're in the same circle. I actually didn't have that one.
Oh, sorry.
And then so the narrator asked, would that be a problem? She paused. No, I don't think so, but be careful. They say he's very good at his job. Be careful. They say he's very good at his job. This watchword rings out like a bad omen, depriving the narrator of self-assurance and leaving the reader acutely aware of how apparently random encounters and comments, all of them extraneous to the case and resistant to legal factoring, inflect legal proceedings. Everything becomes potential fodder for adjudication, including the audible tremble in her voice that registers as a delay between her translation from French into English of the other interpreter's translation of a victim's testimony from Dioula, a Mande language spoken in the Ivory Coast and Mali, into French. The point is that there's no outside to the courtroom, no hors text, no stance of the innocent bystander, no booth behind which the translator can hide. Now that we're on the booth, throughout Intimacies, there's a fascinating focus on the booth, as if to lend material concreteness to what Sarah Ahmed calls the phenomenology of an institution, and what Bruno Latour takes up in his account in his ethnography of the legal chamber. The booth functions as a kind of tool being, an interpassive non-human surrogate for the invisibilized translator, but also as a partition between speaker and translator that contributes to the effects of displaced voice and decentered authorship. And we can have the next slide. When I made this observation to Kitamura, this was her response. It's actually only been through speaking with you, meaning me, that I recognize the degree to which the idea of interpassivity is colonized by writing. It's something that is present in my previous novel, Separation, in the figure of the professional mourners, people who are paid to mourn on your behalf. And here it's present in the interpreter, the booth, the interest of the human as object or instrument. The figure of the interpreter is in part effaced by the glass of the booth. She's visible only on its surface. For Robert Fowler and later Slavoj Žižek, interpassivity refers to delegating enjoyment rather than having it yourself. Žižek's example is that of recording devices that watch TV programs in your place. But we could say that the booth or the translator's earpiece or the translator herself are actually equally good examples. The interpreter is a quintessential interpassive subject, reduced to a transmission device, an enabler of others. In the novel, this is brought home by the narrator's realization that she is serving as a go-between. They are only to facilitate contact between rivalrous men. At one point she says, I understood well enough that Adrian, her boyfriend, was not speaking to me, but to Keyes, that I was only the medium through which his statements were passing, that my presence must have been what allowed Adrian to speak so directly to Keyes. This interpassive relation is generalized to translation, cast as outsourced language and cast as outsourced language, and to translators, characterized as substitutional presences lacking proper agency. We can have the next slide. So just go to the second part, the second paragraph. As I looked down at the witness, it prickled through me the strangeness of speaking her words for her, the wrongness of using this I. It was hers and not mine. We interpreters were only extras passing behind the central cast. So given the translator's effacement, it's perhaps no surprise that one of the most arresting moments in Intimacies is one in which the interpreter is recognized. It's a veritable anagnorisis, can't pronounce that, a scene of identification in disidentification, of positional reversal and subjective subsumption. And then you can go to the fourth paragraph here. Then his gaze would travel across the gallery over to the interpreter's booths where I was sitting. He would look directly at me through the glass window and nod, as if to recognize the work that performed, as if to demonstrate the level of civility and consideration. This became routine, but the first time it happened, it was so unexpected that it felt unreal, as if he had ruptured some fourth wall. From then on, the former president never failed to acknowledge me. In those first days in chamber, I was certain that I would never grow accustomed to this moment of recognition, the meaning of which remained unclear to me. Okay, I don't need to read the whole thing. This is a very unsettling passage, however. The interpreter is brought out from the shadows of the booth, but at what price? It seems that her recognition depends on her evacuation, her dehiscence into the body of the defendant, leaving one to ask, what kind of justice is this? Is it an act of yielding to the absolute authority of the other, God, divine law, radical evil, the objection of the accused? Or is it a case of just deserts, where a party with no apparent skin in the game, i.e. the translator, is punished for the irreparable harm that language, in its supposedly neutral form as translated speech, commits without knowing it? At the end of Intimacies, the war criminal is acquitted of crimes, and the interpreter feels responsible for the low reputational opinion of the court, which has been denounced by the former president as a tool of Western imperialism and an ineffectual one at that. That said, it is this sense of responsibility that leads the narrator to a greater appreciation of the double standard within the international law, the discrepancy in accountability accorded to disgraced leaders from the global South and those of the global North. We could also say that she arrives at the equally important insight that there is a space of justice in language that is a site of pure mediacy, of means without ends. This is in Walter Benjamin's terms, a site of pure violence, but a violence that's freeing, free, as Werner Hamacher sees it, from, quote, the imposition of legal positings, and end of quote, and attuned to the workings of what he calls an aformative lawlessness within language as such. Such realizations, and here I'm concluding, free the narrator up. She turns down the offer to remain a court interpreter, and with the help of a memory of the dunes near the courthouse, is able to perceive a landscape that, quote, vibrates with possibility. Her lover, Adrian, returns from Portugal and asks, should we go there? A reference most obviously to the dunes, but also readable as a hypothetical that involves tracing a line in their life as a couple from a here to an uncharted there. Catching a glimmer of hope in his eyes, she surprises herself by responding, yes. What are we to make of this ending, especially given her consistent, I don't know, harassment and manipulation by all the men in this story? For me, it reads somewhat ironically, since throughout the novel, we've been schooled to interpret there, not as an indexical sign pointing to a shared space of meaning, a being in common or mid-sign, but rather to a blank field of sheer incommunicability and Unverständlichkeit, ununderstandability. The novel leads us in the lurch of there, swimming upstream in untranslatability, yet aware that unadjudicatability, or justice beyond instrumental ends, with its aformative violence that occasionally breaks through to emancipatory transformation, is in fact one of the myriad forms that untranslatability can take. Untranslatability, unadjudicability, though they lead to impasses in personal and legal resolution, also offer the possibility of recovered agency, a dissipated, attenuated agency, typical of the interpreter as an interpassive delegate in a court of law, but an agency nonetheless, with the capacity to suspend final judgment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this rich discussion of this novel. And let me just unshare so that I can see who might want to. Thank you very much. That was great. To who might want to comment or maybe have a question. I hope I can see your hands. I see one hand. Dominique, please go ahead. You're muted, I think.
No.
Okay.
Yes. Sorry, I didn't mean to raise my hand because I was still thinking about my question, but I can go while everybody else is thinking about their contributions. Thank you, Emily. This was so stimulating, and I couldn't help think of the latest war crimes trial and the sergeant who was sentenced to life in prison today, if I'm not mistaken, and the odd circumstance that there are two very close languages that are being used, and probably there is no need for an interpreter in this case, but still it's one of those protocols that do more than what they're supposed to do, which is make language A understandable to language B, but really rehearse a kind of decorum. And I was thinking that the war criminals in the novel, for example, or in historical reality, have a kind of an advantage over the many people who have or do not have access to interpreters and translators, namely the millions of refugees. And I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about this.
Well, actually, your question dovetails exactly with the first part of my remarks for tomorrow's seminar, where I'll be looking at Ukrainian and Russian and some of the situations there. So for anyone who has the courage to continue with me tomorrow, I think I'll be going into some of what your rich question raises in more depth tomorrow. But, you know, I don't have a ready answer to this question of those who don't have translators, other than to say that it's something people really rarely think about. But beyond the fact that it's a shocking deprivation of rights if there is no affirmed or defended right to translation, there's also something else which goes on, which is hugely important in the processing of asylum petitions and the evaluation of cases of refugees, which I have looked at a little bit more closely while working with a Lebanese artist named Lawrence Abu Hamdan, who actually tries to visualize, he uses as material the application forms of people whose speech is being evaluated to see if they are who they say they are. Now, how is this determined? It's determined through an accent test, a shibboleth. So if you say you're from northern Somalia and your accent analysis is outsourced to somebody who just knows English or thinks they know how Somalian is supposed to sound, but can they really account for northern Somalian, southern, whether somebody has, in fact, a parent from another place or has grown up partially somewhere else? Of course not. So he, in part of one of the works that he does, he has all of these tests that show accepted,
Radical.
rejected.
Radical changes or
Sorry,
I think
more changes?
please mute
I
yourself.
think
Mhm.
interference, yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks. So anyway, the point being that translation is a kind of very complicated force field extending to the accent test. And translation becomes a form of what Abu Hamdan calls linguistic passporting, an identity check, like a fingerprint. But the problem is this is so easily distorted, and the outsourcing of these tests goes to people in, you know, Scandinavian countries and Britain and places where you really have to wonder if there is an ear training that could possibly account for authentication of an accent. So what you're alerting us to is this absolutely enormous kind of force field of translation that influences, that is rarely taken on when people discuss how refugees are treated in detention centers, but also more importantly, whether or not their applications for citizenship or residency go through or not. And it in a sense points us to all of those failed applications on the basis of language.
Great. Dustin,
Thank you.
you're muted.
Yes, yeah, sorry. Thank you. Thank you for the excellent talk. It reminded me particularly in this association of justice and translation with Derrida's article on relevant translation. Are you familiar with that?
Oh yeah,
I've always hated
it. Yeah,
I've always hated that article until after your talk. Now I'm reconsidering it in my head and thinking, okay, maybe what you said was obviously much clearer than what he says in that article. But I'm curious then about this connection then, right? He takes this, for those who haven't read the article, he takes this passage from Shakespeare, right? When justice seasons mercy. And then talks about how great a translator he is for a while, but then brings it back around to this idea of, you know, translation as this sort of economic travail, right? Where you are sort of objectifying to a certain extent what it is that you're translating in order to sort of guarantee it this Fortleben in the Benjaminian sense, right? That the translation will somehow allow the body of the text to survive. So what you've done here really interestingly, I think, is sort of put this into an actual court context, right? So just from Shakespeare's sort of court scene through these actual court contexts to this other sort of work about court. But now I keep, you know, in my head, it keeps coming back to this question of mercy then. So where is mercy in these translations, or is there mercy? What does it mean to have a just translation, a relevant translation? Could there be a merciful translation? I don't know. These are just sort of thoughts that you kicked up in my head. So I was just curious if you had any thoughts on them. Thank you very much.
Well, I actually published an article in Comparative Literature called Justifying the Humanities, where I really spent the whole second half on that essay, and it raises all kinds of questions. I mean, absolutely agree that there are few pieces written by anybody that gets into the questions of the economics of translation. The play in question is The Merchant of Venice, and the debt and the pound of flesh, and how remainders of what doesn't carry over or falls outside of regimes of equivalence function. And that's, of course, been really crucial to mine and many others' notion of the untranslatable. It's the remainder, the rest, the leftover that can't be assimilated. But it's also this idea that Derrida questions whether there could be any formula of equivalence. And mercy in that sense, or pardon, becomes a form of sublating. And the whole thing about relevance is from the verb, from aufheben, there's the origin of Aufhebung, the Hegelian notion of sublation. And in a sense, I think what the merciful translation would be the sublated translation that denies the very terms by which equivalence is measured, throws all of that into question. It leaves you in a sea of sort of incommensurable translatability or untranslatability. It's in a sense kills the possibility of any truly just translation. But what he does in another piece is he introduces, borrowing from the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, a neologistic verb called justicing. And I think the gerund, the justicing in translation, is more what I take away. I put these two things from Derrida together, which he doesn't do, and come up with this notion of justicing in translation as a process, as not an arrival at a just translation, but as a process of justicing, which is always incommensurate and always, in a sense, grappling with failure. And that's what I thought was also very interesting in this novel. But it's given a kind of effective character who takes on failure and apology. And my point also in that other essay I wrote was really that the humanities, it struck me, was always trying to justify itself. And it was its whole history as a discipline, certainly in comparative literature, but once I started tracking it, was racked by formal apologies. A lot of the classic books start out apologizing, in a sense, granting themselves some act of mercy before the fact. So I was having fun with that, but it's a nice question. What is a merciful translation?
Thank you. That was really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I also had a quick question. I was thinking about how to sort of structure your rich talk for myself. And one thing that came to my mind is a very obvious thing. It seems like there's perhaps a difference that one can make between translation and interpretation. It's an obvious one, and it's clear that interpreters translate as well, but there's an added element in interpretation, which is presence, performative, and oral, and that is the presence of the voice. And I think it's a crucial one. And you had just mentioned Abu Hamdan, and when you are in his installations, then I know you know that they very often have to do with voices whose origins you cannot necessarily see. So I wanted you to think a little bit about this phenomenon of the voice, either be it in relation to the novel or generally speaking, and its impact on translation, which seems utterly crucial, and not only on translation, but also on the whole idea of the law, right? Because in a courtroom, it's not generally a matter of the written law. Well, it is, but it is the written law, as it were, encoded by voices, right? By voices who speak, who debate, who talk, who translate as well. So it seems to me that it's important to bring in this element of the voice and to not merely talk about translation, because the two, while obviously entangled with each other, are not quite the same. And in relation to that, a slightly different yet maybe related point, and that is the whole question of colonialism, that in the novel plays perhaps an important role. I must confess, I haven't had a chance to read much of it. But I'm wondering this in relation not obviously to the fact that there's an African dictator on trial, but also to the status of English. You didn't make much of that, but it's sort of curious that it seems to be absolutely natural that it's all translated into English. What does that mean? So English is, as it were, the reference language by definition for these proceedings. And I guess everybody can sort of agree on that today. But I'm wondering, would it make sense to talk more about this and the relationship between English, let's say, and those African languages that you also mentioned, but that seem to play a lesser role in that they are, you know, these seem to be happening sort of on a side stage. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly about the relationship between this point and the voice, but I could imagine there might be one. So anyway, those are my scattered impressions.
I mean, the voicing, this is precisely where I'm going with translation theory at the moment. I agree that there is a distinction in professional interpreting in court between the role of the voice and the translation as a kind of profession that involves text or literature. But something that a literary work about an interpreter does, or the work of Abu Hamdan for that matter, is that it problematizes the term voice, because you know, we're now accustomed to hearing the critique leveled at discourse in general, at public discourse, at academic representation, that certain people's voices are excluded and not being heard. And it seems to me that one of the most interesting things that's going on in contemporary fiction and poetics is the registering of voices that haven't been heard, whether they're in indigenous voices, whether they're minorities, whether they are gender minorities, the excluded of all kinds. And this is something that I think that in my vision of translation is more and more important. In other words, to not just restrict it to what most people think of as translation, which is a literary translation from one work to another, or nonfiction, but that is primarily writing based as opposed to voiced. And it seems to me that the translation of affect, the translation not just of speech, which is crucial, but also of tone of voice. Well, novelists have always been good at that. In a sense, fiction writers are the fantastic translators and ventriloquizers of tone in the way that they qualify or ramify how dialogue or speech is taken through, whether it's through some form of projected consciousness of a narrator or the way in which a scene is described subsequent to the dialogue, so that you are given guidance as to what the affect is. And so in a sense, part of the problem here is that voice is a metaphor, and it's something that can be quite localized. It's you know, vibrations and vocal cords, it's speech acts of various kinds that have situational applications and consequences, solicit effects. But then there's voice in the sense of something more metaphorical and diffuse that is, and comes back to this politics of, you know, so the micro politics of voicing through tone and innuendo. And to me, I want to extend translation to that area, to translation theory, to take that on, not just the voices of the excluded in a kind of statistical sense, but the inclusion of material that wouldn't be called translation. And I think that the interpreter is a particularly good example because of what you just said. You know, the speech act and the orality of what is being translated is particularly foregrounded in the work of the professional translator. And so, but what makes this a bit tricky in the novel is that it's a novel about that. So you're getting both at the same time. And that's what I tried to indicate by talking about the double channels, sometimes interfere with each other. is that you're getting, in a sense, a meta commentary on the voicing as you are getting the transcription of the voicing and the staging of the voicing, but in a fictional narrative mode. So it's a very complicated sort of dynamic of structure. And the second question was about
it was about colonialism.
Yeah, I mean, so I had to really track to see if there was any African language present in this text. And I only found one reference to Dioula in the testimony of one of the victims, the main testimony of the victim against the dictator. And it's just one passing reference, very easy to miss. For the rest, it's, you know, there's Arabic, there's, and what's interesting here, to come back to Dominic's point, is that they do have a translator from Dioula into French, and then she translates the French into English. But that doesn't mean there isn't a colonial language structure going on throughout. And that's why I included that example of the jihadi, because, you know, that was a more contemporary instance of colonial language politics. But after 9/11, weaponization of Arabic by, you know, the use of it by the State Department as a language of terror, it was overpowering. And, you know, this hasn't gone away. I was looking at a number of instances of this in some previous work. And the whole question of, you know, there are the world languages, which already have a power struggle among them, whether it's Mandarin, English, Spanish, you know, what they call the muscle languages. And then there's the power struggle among tongues that are typical of smaller countries that have less power. And then there are the infinite number of dialects and vernaculars and pidgins and creoles that don't, you know, really have, that are unempowered languages. This is something that Pascal Casanova wrote about, not just in the World Republic of Letters, but also the World Republic of Languages. There's a world language power struggle, and it's very interesting. I was just in Brussels and passed the European Court, and, you know, they have on one side of one of the buildings, they have all the languages, but of course, what are all the languages, right? They're engraved on the side of the wall, and it's a very selective list, you know, but they have thousands of languages that are available and translators for them. But the question is, as you point out, toward which language are they going? English.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and so we are dealing with a world where there is a linguistic imperium, and to really, you know, I'm not the first or by far the only one to be hyper aware of this, but the imperium of English affects how we think about, you know, international justice. It just does. Used to be French. You know, what are the languages of diplomacy? But
yeah, I mean, it's ironic that these are also the big colonial languages.
Yeah.
You know, it's ironic when, I mean, somebody from Africa standing trial in a court in Holland, is that in the Hague?
The Hague, yeah.
You know, in English. That's something to certainly think about. So that was a little bit the nature of my question, but maybe there are other comments or questions.
Just a simple comment. Actually, I had a question before you, but it was very close to you, Sven. So I'm going to go to another one, which is in a certain way obvious to me. I haven't read the novel, but just the title, Emily, of Intimacy and Intimacies, and then the comments on the look of the dictator, the ex-president,
of Adrienne, her vulnerability when she thinks her voice is going to be recognized, etc. It looks like there is a politics of gender or some type of the vulnerability is looked at from the viewpoint of that female tool, you know, the kind of truchement that she is playing, whereas the other ones, like the male actors in the trial with their different roles, seems to be all looked at by their kind of seduction or seductiveness. So I was wondering if you have some comments about that.
Yes, I mean, in fact, I did have something I didn't have time for. She said to me when I started with that anecdote from the book about the rape, which is somehow echoed in countless ways throughout the novel. Yeah, so Kitamura says, it was interesting because I wrote the first draft of the book and then went back and read it. And I realized that there were just vast amounts of sexual harassment and sexual intimidation throughout the novel. And I thought that was so wild because I kept bringing it up in our discussion. She was almost like, right, she hadn't realized. I think that's an interesting thing, that she was writing a story about an interpreter, and she didn't set out to, make a big point in this book about the kind of the presence of a harassment case that never goes to trial. It's really that kind of underplot. There are more than one instance. She's harassed by her lover, who simply disappears on her and really kind of tortures her because she keeps waiting in his apartment for him to come back and trying to find out what's going on. So this is one form. And then there's this attorney who, on first meeting her, just to piss off the boyfriend, pretends that they already know each other and puts his arm around her waist. And there's another scene where, in a kind of right before they go into court, where he's utterly menacing and he sort of uncrosses his legs and comes at her, and you really brace yourself for some kind of rape. It doesn't happen, but it's going on. Those are the sort of obvious things. And then there are the countless ones that, as you say, are just at the level of the looks, of the commanding, subordinating looks, and the relay and how they play out in the courtroom. And I think what's kind of interesting here is that it doesn't hit you over the head with a theme. It's part of the fabric of the interactions. It's part of the way translation happens in an institutional setting in the modern world. And it shows you that it doesn't even have to be, gestures or something physically menacing in the form of an assault, but it's more the psychic power plays and forms of subordination that are built into the structure of the interpreter's situation vis-a-vis the court. So there's, in a sense, already a kind of abusive relationship, which is why when she's offered the full-time job at the end and she doesn't take it, her employers are just shocked, but you did really well. And she, again, without spelling it out, it's clear that this has been abusive on a number of levels, including her sense that it's a colonial operation and she doesn't want to be part of it. So yeah, it's a good read for a more subtle treatment of how harassment works than I think other kinds of texts that have been written in the wake of Me Too.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, you've certainly made me curious to read this book. So I think we've pretty much reached the end of this event. We try to generally limit our lectures to 1 hour. So I'd like to thank you, Emily, again for this wonderfully rich talk, and everyone for being here and for making such subtle points and asking questions. Thank you so much. Reminder about the seminar tomorrow at 10. If you would like to attend, here is the email. Again, please send us a brief email and we'll send you the information you need. So with that, thank you so much and hope to see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Thank you. See you
Thank you.
tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Great. Oh, Rachel, you're still there. Okay.
Yeah, I thought I'd stick around.
Yeah, you're the only one who left. Okay, great. Yeah, so that went well.
Very well. You can probably stop recording.
Oh, yeah, yes. I never